Set the tone for the day is the reason our first keynote speaker has been chosen. He's Fergus Hanson from the Walk Free Foundation, an organisation dedicated to ending all forms of modern slavery this generation. So he's going to talk to us about the work of the foundation and then give an example of how that works in practice. We'll be hearing lots of people of experience talking about examples of good governance and how it works in practice, which I think is exciting to hear ideas and principles fleshed out from real life examples. You know, I was always taught as a journalist, don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, or don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to. And Fergus has for us today a case study about the power of actually asking those questions that you suspect you don't want to know the answer to. The context is reviewing the supply chain from top to bottom. He has an example of where that happened, you know, unlike opera, nobody died in the end. So please make him very welcome, Fergus Hanson.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you to Cardno for the invitation to speak here today. It's a real honour to be able to speak at your conference. About 2 years ago today, I was working at my dream job at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, when I received a phone call very early in the morning from Andrew Forrest, Chief of Staff, asking whether I'd be able to apply some of the ideas I've been working on in the innovation space to helping to end modern slavery. A few very persuasive conversations with Andrew later, I found myself on a plane to Perth, and that's where I've been for the last almost 2 years. And when I tell people that I'm now working on trying to counter modern slavery, I think quite a few of them reckon that I'm joking. Wasn't slavery abolished, and a very long time ago? And I can empathise with that reaction, because when I first started with Andrew, I had only the vaguest inkling of just how pervasive the modern forms of slavery are. We estimate that there are 30 million people living in conditions of modern slavery today. And while it's common to associate slavery with the sex trade, that's only in fact a very small part of the problem. A much larger proportion of people find themselves trapped in situations of forced labour, like debt bondage. This sees people take on debts to pay for things such as medical emergencies in exchange for their labour. The problem is that the interest rates charged are so high, and that food and other necessities are added onto the debt, that it can quickly become absolutely impossible to repay the debts. So much so that parents can actually pass on these debts to their children, creating cycles of intergenerational slavery. The other types of modern slavery that we look at are forced marriages, child labour, forced begging, domestic servitude, and remarkably, in some countries, even chattel slavery, the literal buying and selling of people. So to put it briefly, slavery is when a person's liberty is systematically removed through force, debt, inheritance or circumstances, and the person is unable to leave their place of work. The slavery present today is so affronting that it's, when I first started meeting with the survivors and hearing their stories, I quickly realised that I just wasn't cut out for frontline action. The stories are almost impossible to assimilate in your mind, and just when you think that there's no possible way that there's a more depraved way that a person could be treated, you find out that there is, and there's another, and another, and another. These stories, for me, might be possible to digest if it was an isolated incident, but when you start seeing them reproduced and replicated at scale, it really struck me how much slavery is what a massive, massive industry slavery is, and how it permeates into every country on earth. This is where I'd like to segue to Andrew Forrest, the founder of the Walk Free Foundation. Now, people often ask me how Andrew came to this issue. And it started with his eldest daughter, who was on a trip to Nepal to work in an orphanage in her final years of school. She came back really enthused from the experience, so much so that she convinced the family to go back for their next family holiday. But when the Forrests returned, the situation that met them was very different. The only girls that were left in the orphanage were those that were extremely disfigured or disabled. And after a bit of investigation, it turned out that, for want of a better word, that the girls were the orphanage existed to upskill the girls before the sale into the sex trade. Because modern slavery takes so many forms and involves business, government, and wider society, the response that the Foundation has taken and the stakeholders that it engages have been similarly wide-ranging. And I thought I'd take a moment just to sort of sketch out what those are. The first pillar of Walk Free is a global movement of people calling for strengthened measures to prevent slavery. The online movement has a membership that spans almost every country on earth, and at the moment the supporter base is around about 6 million people. The second pillar is a research arm, and it produces the annual Global Slavery Index, which is the first baseline measure of slavery prevalence rates country by country. So this not only provides a measure or an estimate of the number of slaves in each country around the world, it also looks at the response that government is taking. And the next major project that they're looking at is a business index. And this is still in its beta stage of development and receiving feedback from business, but the aim is to try and help large global companies better understand their risk profile when it comes to assessing their use or inadvertent use of slave-produced goods or services. The third pillar of Walk Free is the fund team, and this has been responsible for the launch of the Freedom Fund, which was launched at the Clinton Global Initiative last year, $30 million in seed funding, aiming to be $100 million with 2 other partners. And it's looking at funding and financing grassroots interventions for direct liberation and reintegration of people living in slavery, with the ambition of proving the scalability of these interventions. The plan is to then follow this up with a much larger global fund to end slavery that will take these successful interventions and scale them up worldwide. This aspect of our work has also seen us engage directly with countries, and there was an interesting example of this I thought I'd share in this context, which was an agreement we reached a couple of weeks ago with the Punjab government. And this agreement was 2 memorandum of understanding. The first one was an agreement on the transfer of technology to help the Punjab government convert its lignite coal deposits to diesel. And the second MOU was an agreement to work with us to implement a provincial eradication plan to eradicate slavery across Punjab. Now, I'm due to go to Lahore next month for the first implementation meeting, so I can't tell you how successful that process is going to be, but it does show an interesting synergies you can get with a corporate philanthropist. Finally, and this is where I want to focus most of my remarks, there's business engagement. The globalisation of supply chains has meant that slavery has inadvertently crept into many business and government supply chains. So through this pillar, we're undertaking a number of activities, one of which is Andrew engaging in chairperson-to-chairperson discussions to look at ways to minimise risk, and most of this is happening behind the scenes. But Andrew comes at this from a fairly unique position, having thrown the first stone at the company that he established, Fortescue Metals Group. Beginning in September 2012, Fortescue commenced a program of requiring all existing suppliers and new suppliers to sign a statutory declaration certifying that the company has thoroughly investigated the labour practices of its own company and those of its direct suppliers to ensure there is no slavery or forced labour used anywhere in the company, or any of the direct suppliers to the company. Now, as part of this process, Fortescue also undertook a supply chain mapping exercise to identify the areas of highest risk. And that ended up triggering an audit process of one of these suppliers when it was discovered that they were withholding the passports of their workers at one of their manufacturing plants, a widely recognised indicator of the risk of forced labour. Fortescue ended up engaging Verite, which is a leading non-profit social auditing organisation, to undertake a labour standards audit of that company's particular plant. And the audit confirmed that many production workers had paid illegal recruitment fees, some of them up to 2 years' salary. And many of the workers had to borrow money to pay for these fees, and some of them at interest rates of up to 60%. So while the supplier had not charged the fees themselves, they'd not executed their own company's policies, which was to ensure that workers were not charged for the opportunity to apply for a job. The audit process also confirmed that while the management regarded it as voluntary that the workers submitted their passports, the workers themselves regarded it as compulsory and that they would receive their passports upon repayment of their debts. The findings confirm just how real the risk of debt bondage and forced labour is for, I think, contemporary companies, being only one removed from Fortescue's immediate operations. Following the audit results, the senior executives of both the supplier and Fortescue worked together on a remediation strategy. This involved the repayment of the workers' debts by the supplier and the installation of safes in their labour camps so that they could store their own passports. Now, I really like this story because I think it offers a very different case study for business from the one that we usually hear in the media. The stories we read about in the media are usually of the gotcha variety, where companies are found, usually inadvertently, to be using slave labour or at least very poorly paid labour in their supply chains. By contrast, Andrew has publicly talked about Fortescue's experience with forced labour many times, and there's been no gotcha moment, and there's also been no brand damage to Fortescue. And I think that speaks to the value of playing offence rather than defence when it comes to dealing with slavery. It was pretty straightforward for Fortescue to put in place measures to significantly mitigate the risk of its inadvertently using slave labour in its supply chains. And when it found it, it played out a lot better for it, dealing with the challenge that it confronted. The other thing I like about this story is I think it shows just how easy it is for well-meaning and very well-run companies to inadvertently contribute to one of the most horrific crimes. At the moment, we are all unwilling users of slave-produced goods, whether it's the cotton shirt on our backs, the chocolates we're going to eat with our coffees, the cell phones that we're carrying around in our pockets. The chance that these have utilised slave labour is actually very real. But as many companies, and I'm sure in this room Fortescue is definitely not alone, are demonstrating by taking some very simple measures to understand and secure their supply chains, this situation is gradually being turned around. One other very practical way that we're working towards trying to contribute on this issue is through a partnership with the Chartered Institute for Procurement and Supply, or CIPS, which has a network of about 100,000 members. This is working to ensure that all members are aware of the risks of modern slavery in supply chains, that they're able to identify areas of vulnerability, and that they're in a position to do something about it. And this is being implemented through mainstreaming modern slavery, through codes of conduct, ethical guidelines, and also into their training programs. Now, there's obviously many other areas that we're working on, but I hope that gives you just a snapshot of where Walk Free is trying to come at this problem, and particularly from the business side of things. Now, I'm not sure that there's any time for questions right now, but if anyone has any questions afterwards, I'd be really delighted to speak with you afterwards.